So about 5 years ago, there was a gal who I think our kids go to school together who helps with the Education Foundation's Great Conversations event, which I'm told is this great event. She had emailed me and she'd asked me to consider hosting a table at that event. And my understanding is that they find a table host who picks a topic, and then that person kind of curates or moderates a conversation over the course of the night, and attendees, they get to pick which conversation they want to be a part of. And she, in her email, which of course was a really flattering email, in her email she said that her idea was to speak to this question of, well, why is Narrate a growing church when so many other churches across the country are shrinking? And I mean, obviously, again, that was super flattering, but to me the whole picture's somewhat sad. It prompted me to think a lot about that question, and yet I was thinking about that experience this week. I'd forgotten all about it. I didn't make the cut, so I didn't necessarily, which is okay, but I hadn't thought a lot about it since. But what occurred to me this week was 5 years ago, I had no way of knowing that in 2020, a series of events would occur, starting with a pandemic and then a season of unrest racially and otherwise across the country, and then a political cycle that was unlike anything even my 70-year-old friends had ever seen, that would, I dare say, make what was true for the majority of churches 5 years prior true for all of them. And yeah, there's a way that you can do some unique counting or whatever, but it's, to me, worth just sitting with this idea that 5 years later, it's every church in the country that's suddenly shrinking. And so what I want to do this morning, I'm really hesitant to talk about us, and because I think the hero of the story is God and you all, but it strikes me this morning that it's probably an appropriate time to do the type of Sunday that generally we would do in early September and call it Vision Weekend, or something that we would do in August and call Calling All Owners, but just to kind of capture the fact that we just passed a one-year cycle of everything that we've been through as a culture and as a community together, to just speak to a few things. I think there's a lot of long overdue thanks that I owe this room, and at the same time, there's some invitations I'd like to make. And I'd like to speak to this kind of looming question of what is the future of the church? Because it seems to kind of hang over so many things that we've done for the last year, especially if you're a person of faith. Now, I don't know when that hit for you. I would love to know in your own interactions, in your own experience of life, when was it that it occurred to you that the future may not look anything like the past? And for those of you, the fact that you're in the room tells me that you probably had some connection with church like this pre-COVID. When did it occur to you that the extent to which church ever looks like it used to is really unclear? For me, it was a year ago this weekend. This would have marked our second weekend of being online only. But the first week was, and probably this is true for lots of us in lots of ways, the first week was just an adrenaline rush. On Tuesday of the week, of our first week of shutting down, we were talking about whether or not it would be okay to have communion, which is hilarious to think about, because by Friday at about 10:30 at night, we were canceling church. There was no music that week. It was this kind of raw, it was fun, but it was adrenaline. But in the second week, Justin and Tommy had done a lot of work on the tech side. We had live music. And I don't know if you watched that first experience. I'll never forget it, because I was standing back there at the top of the stairs. We were actually live that Sunday. I think as things evolved, we started recording earlier in the week for reasons that really helped the tech. But that Sunday, I remember coming to the top of the stairs as Tommy started into the music. It was just Tommy with his guitar and Teresa on the hand drum. And at the risk of making it about me, I remember being back there and I was just overwhelmed with emotion. Because in my 20 years of working in church and really attending church, I had never seen anything like it. It was just, to me, so sad that there was this empty room and we were doing what we do, but we were doing it for people online, which of course was an honor, but it was this kind of dichotomous thing of like, wait a minute, does this thing that we do together, does it even matter? How do we do this thing? And that's, I think, really the question that it deserves our attention of like, what is the future of the church? My experience of that question, and again, I'm sure you had your own, was it felt like every time I turned around, whether I was reading something or listening to something, Like I really had to begin to prune the podcast that I listened to because I found like even people from my own sector, there was just all this speculation and all this alarm. Oftentimes when I was walking with people or talking with people, there were so many different angles. Some people who have this deep affection for local church, and they were sad and they were trying to figure it out, and other people who frankly have this deep cynicism towards local church, and yet they've kind of found a way to persist on some level, and everything that was happening kind of confirmed to them that the local church as they knew it was dead, and that ought to be the case. And then there were other people who were kind of talking about this hybrid of the two, and for me, it was incredibly emotionally exhausting. It was in that season where a guy named Kerry Newhoff, who's this very good leader from the Toronto area, he has a national voice within church leadership and tends to do fairly researched, kind of data-driven stuff. He published an article, and the only reason I even found the article was because it was in this season where I went searching for familiar voices that I could kind of lean into and make sense of this season with, and one of those names is Andy Crouch, and I found some stuff from him, and that was helpful. And then I found this article from Kerry Newhoff, and he claimed to point to some research that says anytime a crisis hits, part of what we know happens is that any timeline is expedited. And the example he gave was online shopping. He said, pre-COVID, we knew that the percentage of people doing their shopping online and the percentage of shopping being done online was obviously going up and to the right. And what he suggested is that a fairly predictable trend when there's a crisis, whether that's an earthquake or a hurricane or something else, is that what might otherwise take 10 years to get to, that ground might be covered in a single year. And of course, what he was saying is where the trends of online shopping were going, we might not have got there till 2030, but because of COVID, we may get there by 2021. And here again, a year later, you're like, man, that seems obvious. But his reason for writing the article was he wanted to explore another question, and that was this question, and I'm guessing this isn't news to any of us, that the value of local church weekend attendance has been dwindling for decades. And his caution and what he was writing about and what, I don't know the extent to which he was trying to create alarm, but it was definitely this, just another kind of ember in that fire or log in that fire, as he was saying, the trends have been going negative, and where we might have reached by 2030, we may accomplish that in a year. And again, I remember finishing up that article, and I think this is probably a character trait we have in common together. Like I love to think outside of the box, and I don't think I'm the most creative person, but I've spent a lot of time kind of pushing the envelope, and it's kind of relative to your sector, and just this, and I was in this really tight spiral of we got to figure out what's next, we got to figure out what's next, we got to figure it out what's next, we got to get ahead of that curve, and his suggestion was go online. In fact, people like him are saying today that if a church isn't giving 50% of its resources to the online experience, it's not going to have any relevance in the future. And frankly, for me, there was this, it's not a moral thing, but just this like, I'm glad to serve people online to whatever extent that serves them, but I don't want to make that the initial movement. I think we think of this as we're glad to create a window into what we're doing here, but I'm just not interested in being an online presence in that way. But just, again, over and over, what's the future of this thing? And I'm sure you have your own experience, and if you'd be willing to go for a walk, I'd love to hear yours. Then, I think it was mid-October, the Barna Group, and you may or may not be familiar with the Barna Group, but they're, again, a very reputable Christian research organization, and I've been hot and cold on them over the course of my tenure. Sometimes their stuff makes me mad, and sometimes I find it encouraging. A guy named David Kinnaman has taken it over recently, and he wrote a book called Unchristian years ago that was super helpful. So I kind of watch it a little bit. And they published some research in October, so just a little over 6 months from the start of COVID. And the first thing, and they were just trying to gauge like what's happened with local church attendance. And you can go to the next slide, Jack. The first thing that he said is this: so pre-COVID, 86% of American adults attended a church service in person or online at least one time in the prior year. Now, first of all, that reminds me how relatively unchurched we are in the Northwest, because 86% I can't believe how high it is. But 86%, he's saying, pre-COVID, if you ask the average American adult, yeah, at least once in the last year I've been to a service. Since COVID, it's 47%. And again, we're talking online as well. So we're not just saying in person or online, their research says it's now 47%. Hold off on that next slide for just a second, Jack. The other thing, let me kind of set this up. Then the other part of the research, and I put the study on the mind map, which is online or in the back of the room if you want to look at it. It's an article worth reading. There's lots of nuance to it. I don't tend to dwell in the kind of specificity of it all that much. But the other one that stood out to me was pre-COVID, they defined a regular church attender as someone who attends once a month and says that they've attended at least once in the last 6 months. So they would say that's kind of the normal, what you'd call a church attender. Their research would say, go ahead, Jack, to that next one, 20% of those people have done nothing by way of online or in person since the start of COVID. Now, let me just say, judgment is the opposite of my point of all that. My point really is, I think there's some long overdue thank yous. Because as all this was crashing down, as everything that was happening that we've experienced, one of the things that I was able to convey to the staff was we're okay. Like, we don't know if we're okay permanently. Nobody does. If you remember back in March, there was no talk of stimulus and all these things. Like, we were all wondering the extent to which our paychecks were secure. But I'm so thankful for different groups of people because in March, I was able to look at the staff and say, listen, your job may be different, but you still have one. And it still requires that we all do things. And for the most part, what it involved was the staff getting really, really busy just meeting with people. And like, so proud of Lexi. She started calling up moms, and she's even like done some work where she'll come sit with kids for a while, and the mom's gonna go do their thing. Like, everyone just got creative in spending time with people. But the reason I was able to do that, frankly, has a lot to do with our council. There's 6 of them on there, 7 including me. But something you may or may not know, depending on how long you've been around here, was about 10 years ago, a conversation started in the council. And the conversation was, would it be wise for us to run our finances the way we think a wise family runs theirs? And by that, they were talking about, in a business, you would call it retained earnings. In the Dave Ramsey realm, you would call it building an emergency fund of 3 to 6 months. But they started talking about, should we do that? Now, the tension there, of course, and this is the criticism I've even heard from friends, is people aren't giving you their money so that you can invest it or save it. They're giving you your money to invest it in the kingdom. And so one line of thought in church world is you shouldn't have a cash flow because people are giving you their money to serve people with, so you shouldn't be holding it. That conversation among the council, though, was nuanced in several ways. First of all, we're as committed as we could be to being a portable church. It's funny to think about, like 12 years ago, we said, what would it be like to be a church that felt perpetually portable? And then COVID happened. Turns out we're a church plant again. But the conversation was, let's stay portable. We think this allows us we love that we get to serve the Grand Street. We love that our rent goes to a public facility. We love that when someone is figuring out whether or not to go to church, that they know that we couldn't possibly butcher chickens there because it's public space. Like, we just like all of that. But from a financial security standpoint, what that means is, like, the church that I learned from, their emergency fund was a line of credit because they had a $10 million facility and 30 acres, and so like lots of businesses, they knew that in a pinch, they could pull equity out or they could have a line of credit. Our startup capital from them came from their line of credit. The council knew, like, we wouldn't have that option because it's not a moral thing, but we wouldn't likely own that type of stuff. We also knew that if something like a projector broke and it was 10 grand, that we didn't want to have to start passing a bucket around. We didn't want to do designated giving, and so we wanted to have an emergency fund in the same way you have one for your wash machine. And then there was this reality of, there might be some kingdom opportunity that comes along, and we want to be able to move quick. The Grand Street might burn down, and we don't want to just be asking for a favor, but to have resource. My point is fittingly, it was in August of 2019 that the council, and the way it went was 1.5% of giving the first year, and 3% the second, and 4.5% the third. Because the idea was just, we won't even feel it if we just kind of inch our way through it. We never got to 10 because by August of 2019, they felt like they had funded that emergency fund. And therefore, in the tumultuous nature of all of this, we were able to say to the staff, thanks. And frankly, that thanks extends to many of you as well that are invested in this place. Here's the astonishing thing. We actually didn't ever have to dip into it because the giving just stayed constant. And we finished last year in the black, and we're in it now. So So thank you. And there was times where we were able to make aggressive decisions not knowing whether or not how we'd be paying for them. I still remember there was a week, it was pretty early on, Justin, it was one of those, like, we hired him for one job and then COVID happened and Justin's job became so much bigger and all the tech stuff, and he's done such a good job, him and Tommy both. But the tech computer he inherited was just a couple years old, and when we bought it, it was the biggest MacBook Pro we could find. But because of now we were doing slides online and all this other stuff through the online experience and YouTube, and I don't even understand everything he does. It's like the space shuttle back there to me. But there was a week, he told us about it the following Tuesday, where the MacBook was plugged into the wall. So it was drawing power from the wall, and when he looked at the little battery icon on his computer, he was still draining power. And on Tuesday, he told us that, and the council went, go buy a new computer. So I guess I'm saying all that to say thank you. Thanks for being a part of this with us. Thanks for continuing to buy in. Thanks for serving. Some of you were here and it was like against your own kind of judgment. And again, we've worked so hard to not judge those who are or aren't. We get that we all are going to go about this in different ways. But the reality is our ability to do the online thing is directly tied to our ability to do the in-room thing. And many of you have been a part of that. And thank you. What's the future of church? And there was this like up and down. And I'm sure your business had the same thing. Are we going to pay the mortgage? There's this crazy thing. Well, for me, the part where it finally kind of became secure, I guess, where it became clear, it was a Monday morning, and Mondays are my day off, and generally Mondays are the day that I go for a long run or a long bike ride and just try to get out of my conscious and put earbuds in, oftentimes not even listening to the podcast, but just to get out. And it was November 1st, the Entree Leadership, which is one of my favorite podcast streams, Dave Ramsey's leadership thing. They drop one on Monday morning, and so I always kind of look forward to who that's going to be. And on that Monday, it was Seth Godin. And I don't know if you know about Seth Godin. If you don't, he's one of my all-time favorite thinkers. He has been since even before Narrate. He wrote a book called The Dip that really formed the way we did Narrate. Linchpin's one of my all-time favorite books. Seth Godin is this really aggressive, kind of creative marketer guy, like nerdy and hilarious all at the same time. And so I was pumped when I saw this podcast dropped. I parked my car up on the Echo side of the Scratch Gravels. I headed out on my ride, put Seth Godin in my earbuds. I think it was about a 40-minute podcast, and that day I just kind of went, what would it be, to the northwest part, and there's this, what we call figure 8 out there, and I was just kind of looping that. And I finished it one time, and a podcast's good when it is good, or you didn't understand it. When the minute it's over, you just kind of pulled a little thing on the bar back, and I just started it all over again. And I was some parts like deeply entertained and connected, and some parts really agitated by it. I couldn't figure it out. Nothing he was saying was that new to me, other than go for it, take a risk, ship, those types of ideas. When I finished it the second time, I had this overwhelming kind of clarity. And actually, I've not listened to Seth Godin since. Not because I think there's something wrong with him, because what really kind of landed hard on me in that moment was this realization that, and frankly, it was a kind of a moment of repentance for me. And the realization was, my whole adult life, I've kind of built an identity around being the starter, the church planner. I hired on at 20 years old, I hired on as an intern of this awesome youth group led by a guy named Vern who was in the process of planning a church the next year. And so that's always been a part of my professional and really church environment. A couple years later, my wife went up to that church he planted to help get the kids ministry going. A few months after that, I went and started the high school crew. They really wanted her, but they knew they had to take me if they got her, which isn't an exaggeration. And so I went up and started this high school ministry. 5 years later, we recognized that Billings is a really hard place to be 20-something, and so we started this thing in a club downtown on Sunday nights for 20-somethings that we called Mosaic. 5 years after that, a bunch of us moved to Helena and planted this church, and many of you have been a part of that. And I realized on that ride that my need to figure out what was next had more to do with my own ego and pride than it did what was right for people. And for me, the overwhelming sense was, Adam, you just have to lay that aside for a couple years. And I'm so thankful for the staff. They really helped me put language to this, and we worked on this for months before, but it just kind of all came together in my head. And the way I started saying it to myself most every day was our job right now is just to hold space for people. I wanted to be the innovator. I was like, nobody's there anyway. We can disrupt the whole thing. Like, to heck with it. Let's mess with it. And in that moment, it became really clear that so many people in my life who were going, no. Now we just hold space. We just create gatherings. We get ready to scatter again. We reserve judgment. We make sure that we just observe that different people are going to have different timelines. But let's just faithfully do what we do and minimize disruptions to people as they kind of figure out what reorientation looks like for them. And it's there where, again, I owe many of you a thanks. So many of you. I mean, it's one thing for me to come to that conviction, but I can't make the coffee, and the staff alone can't lead the music or run the slides or usher people into their chairs. I mean, ushering took on a whole new level. We can't take the little fog machine or whatever that thing is around the chairs and sanitize them. I mean, it's unequivocally had a lot to do with many of you. And I guess before we move into whatever's next, the danger would be that we create this kind of in and out club, and that's really not my intention, but it's worth the risk if that's what it takes for me to just go like, thank you. Because I don't know what Narrate looks like in the future, and I don't really know what the local church looks like in general in the future. But I know that I'm hopeful about it because so many of you have been a part of this thing in this very liminal space. You've helped us hold space. The way I've been saying it to myself is, because this is for me my greatest nightmare, it would be like, it's like the person that suddenly tells you your jeans have been out of fashion for 3 years, right? Like, for me, there was this thing, and I just had to name it in my ego, and the way I started saying it out loud is, if 2 years later we realized that we were trying to sell typewriters, when clearly the market had shifted, and some of the people are right, church as we knew it was over, if 2 years later we realized we were selling typewriters for 2 years after anybody ever wanted one, then we'll be able to be okay with that, because we'll have done that by just helping people transition. So thank you. And yet this question remains, and it's not one that I have any cute answers to. What is the future of church? We don't know. When I talk to my friends across the state, there's some really strong trends, not the least of which is it's the 20 and 30-somethings that are gone. Not completely, but those are the groups that are lagging. And I do have some big wonders like, where is that going? How do we do this? I'm not sure. I don't think I'm any more married to the model than you are, but it seems like what we should be married to, and this, to whatever extent I have clarity, it's around this idea of Jesus is still an irresistible person. Christianity is not always irresistible. The church isn't always irresistible. But I think Jesus still is. And I think there's a danger in saying, I want Jesus, but not the community that comes with it, because at best, we're in really uncharted territory. That in almost every sector, there's this realization that we can't live up to our own ideals, but if we cling to the ideals, then maybe what's real will be close enough. You know, we just went through this incredibly insane season, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that's had conversation after conversation after conversation with people who wonder if the local church even matters anymore, if they're compromised by some kind of political agenda or social agenda. What makes it all the more confusing is it doesn't seem to matter which side you're on. Both sides, if left to themselves, can often have that very same opinion. I think we cling to Jesus. It's why the weekend after Easter, I've never done this before. We've never done it together. We're just going to work through the Gospel of Matthew, like one word at a time, one sentence at a time, at least through the spring. My attention's not going to last long enough to go all 28 chapters, but for sure through the spring and probably through the summer. I think we can do it in a way that keeps it personally relevant to your everyday lives, but also just to sit with who was this guy Jesus and try to really be honest about not just our theology around Jesus, but the gospel writer Matthew and what was he uniquely saying about Jesus. I was sitting with a friend a few months ago who isn't a part of this place, but I've known since I lived here, and he's walked away from faith, and I've been just trying to listen to him and sit with him, and he's not throwing grenades over his shoulder. He doesn't seem to have some agenda. I don't even think he's convinced it's forever. But as I sat and listened to him, and I eventually got to say this to him in our second meeting, what occurred to me was that all his disconnects are with institutions and with people, but he doesn't actually have any disconnects with Jesus, which I think is maybe worth noting. I don't know what the future of the church is. I do sense that we have an important role to play in modeling for a culture what it looks like to leave room for both sides of certain conversations. I've been around church for 20 years. I've always been a part of churches that championed this idea that there's room for people from both sides of the aisle. I have never, until this last election cycle, sat across from people. And I'm not saying they didn't exist before, but not in these types of contexts. But suddenly they're in this context too. I've never sat across the table from people who said, I can't worship with them because they have this political opinion. And here's the absurd part. I won't, but I could name specific people, specific conversations, and they come from both sides of the aisle. I wonder if it's time to remind ourselves that Jesus was a part of a ragtag, motley, diverse crew, men and women. You want to talk economics? Matthew, Judas, probably affluent by their day's standards, not by Herod's standards, but by normal everyday standards. Others of them on the other side of that economic scale. You want to talk culture, political persuasion? Again, great diversity. That Jesus' movement has never been a homogenous crew. It's always been this crew that found truth in the tension. And can you even start to think about the 2024 election and what that might look like if we don't do some deep inner work? I wonder if we get to model for people Jesus in that respect. You know what I ultimately posed to the Great Conversations event. I spent several weeks before we had lunch to talk about it. Ultimately, what I suggested is, I said, I'm scared of the question because I don't want to come across as arrogant. And I'm actually not proud of it because we're all part of the same team. But I said, the only answer that I can give you, that I can come up with where I could lead a conversation around is this idea that by the nature of being a church plant, and I think in 2021 we very much are one again, by the nature of being a church plant, you know that you only get to exist if you add value to the community in which you sit. Like, it's not an entitlement, it's not a birthright. You don't get to do that because 100 years ago there were some people who valued it. You only exist if you find ways to add value. And to me, what I love about so many sectors, especially small business, is there's this deep realization that you exist if you add value to those around you. I think that's our charter, to continue to work hard at that. I don't know about you, but it seems clear to me that our kids will live in a world where not every community has a great local bike shop. Not every community will have a great local coffee shop. I was talking to a funeral home director here a few months ago, and he was saying, Adam, the days are about gone where every small town community in Montana has their own funeral home. It's shifting. But this much seems clear to me. There will be communities with great bike shops, and there'll be great communities with great local coffee shops. But we can all already kind of make assumptions about those places if they exist, can't we? It'll be people led by strong leadership, with a desire to matter to local community, with a strong constituency that buys into the way they add value to community, and the extent to which they do that, there will be a market for good local bike shops. Competitive, difficult, against the grain, undoubtedly. That, I think, is the future of the local church. It bums me out to think my boys may or may not end up living in a community with a great local church. But there will be communities with great local churches. And to me, at the top of the definition of that list is not only adding community, adding value to community, but it's a great place to meet great people. I think there's lots of places in Helena where you could find healthy connections. I don't think there's any place that's any better at being a place where if you just stand next to the fishing pond week after week after week, you're eventually going to rub elbows with somebody that you want to share life with, that you want to do things with. Doesn't mean it'll be universally true. We're not all of the same people. It's not going to be one giant club. But part of what makes sense to me in this COVID season is I think on the other side, there's going to be strong separation between those people who have a vision for sharing their life with others and meeting people they can do that with, and those that don't. I think Cal Newport's book, Digital Minimalism, is proving to be incredibly prophetic, that technology is changing the way we think about relationship. And I'm proud of how hard the staff has worked, and many of you, in just getting better at facilitating this being a place where you can find people. And it doesn't always have to be a Bible study. Just good people to hang out with. We're going to introduce another kind of small group book component to the Matthew series. You can be a part of that, and we still want this to be a place that you can hide. But it also seems that Paul in Galatians, what he says, bear one another's burdens, and in this way you fulfill the law of Christ. Never has it seems more clear that that's a big piece of what it means to be the church together. So what is the future of local church? I don't actually know. I don't know the extent to which this business model, so to speak, is sustainable. I do know I'm incredibly grateful because the fact that we're still here today and poised, I think, to serve people really well this summer and this fall has a lot to do with many of you. So here's my ask, here's my invitation. There's a card there. Every other one is what we call a Calling All Owners card. And I just want to ask everyone to take that home, put it on their bathroom mirror, and would you just not even pray for yourself necessarily, but would you just pray for us as a community for the next couple weeks? And if that means that prompts you to hey, it's time to get back in the game, or it's time to serve people with us for the first time, great. And if that's not the case, then that's okay too. We won't know. But if you just kind of pray, because the tech team, especially Narrate Kids, Narrate Nursery, to be honest, there's some real need there. And the numbers are coming back. I think Gay had 8 babies in the nursery last week in one service. And then there's this, and this is the other thing I'm going to ask you to pray for, and then we're actually going to take communion together. First year we were church together, as we got towards summer, I stood on the stage and I said, listen, go camping, go do your thing. There won't be a sign on the doorstep that makes you feel guilty, like God doesn't leave you, why'd you leave us kind of stuff. Our commitment has always been, we'll do what we can to create great experiences, and when you're around, we'll be here. And that's part of the holding space thing. Here's my sense, and thus here's where I'm going to ask you to think about something. My sense is, and I think it's logical, is that all of us, to a one, are going to be hyper protective of our weekends, starting with Easter and ending when school starts. I've caught myself saying it, I've heard other people say it, we are camping every weekend. Here's my ask. Would you consider circling one weekend in June, and one weekend in July, and one weekend in August, and just making a commitment in as early as Easter that you'll be in town on Sunday to serve 1 week a month? Here's my concern, is if we don't do that, then the few volunteers that remain this summer are going to be exhausted and spent come September. And the staff, we could kill them if we're not careful. I think if we can just find some balance, and we do this, right? You have a wedding in July and you're like, duh, I know what's going to happen. There's going to be this better opportunity, but you're committed to it. If we could just all do that 1 weekend a month through the summer, then I'm so excited about the opportunities that we're going to have to serve people together in September, which, by the way, is when Ales for Trails is this year. So let me pray, and we're going to do communion together. God, Lord, thanks for what you've done in and through us in this season. Thanks for my friends here who, God, I think the part that to me is the most awesome is that on any given Sunday there's 2 ushers or 2 people working on the tech team who frankly are even of different kind of levels of comfort around COVID, and yet they found ways to stand shoulder to shoulder and serve people on Sundays. So God, we're trusting you with we just pray the same prayer we've ever prayed. God, if you can use us, do, and if you're done with us, please make that clear. We love you. Amen.
If you would like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook and Instagram.